All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new meeting of the TMB group. This week, we have with us Costa Savva, and he will be presenting on the Mutual Space Framework, MSF, a speculative framework capable of unifying life, mind, and culture. Well, that's certainly ambitious. Costa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So yes, it is a very ambitious and speculative and misleading title, but I hope to unpack some of what I'm getting at in this talk. So I guess before I start, there are a couple of caveats. My name is Costa. I'm a psychiatry trainee, and I should say that it's a privilege to be here and to be presenting my ideas to this group. I should specify to start with that I'm an outsider to this area. I have no formal background in computational methods or maths or physics. And what I'm doing here is offering speculation. It's not formalized. And I want to apologize in advance if I misrepresent terms. I should also note that in the framework that I'll be presenting, I do coin new terms. I try to define them quite clearly. The reason I do so is to avoid the conceptual slippage associated with using terms existing in the literature that have many meanings. I also want to just take a moment to pass my kind regards on to Prof. Friston from Prof. Greg Friccione at Harvard. Prof. Friccione is someone that I've been liaising with about the original work on catatonia, but actually I've expanded the talk and I will touch on catatonia at the end, but this is what I'll be presenting is a much broader theoretical framework. So I'll start with a bit about who I am and what a functional architecture of mind must need. And then I'll talk a little bit about the different components of the mutual space framework. So I'll touch a bit on energy, information, self-organisation, and then I want to introduce important terms in the framework, such as contingency, narrative structures, and mutual space. And then I want to speak about the neural mutual space, which is the brain, and talk about implications for psychiatry. So I'm a psychiatry trainee doctor with an interest in evolutionary psychiatry, and I'm a member of the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I'm a full-time practicing psychiatrist, and so unfortunately, I haven't got a lot of time or money to work on this stuff. So please bear that in mind also. But I do have very broad interdisciplinary interests, and I won't go through that, but these are some of the books that, for me at least, have been pivotal. So I think we should just jump straight in. Future functional architecture of the mind must have a number of different goals. It must be able to bridge different levels of analysis and generate testable predictions. It must account for both function and dysfunction. And I will try and specify how my framework has implications for dysfunction. It must be consistent with the principles of evolutionary biology. It must have phylogenetic and ontogenetic mappings. And of course, I think it's considered quite commonplace now to appreciate that multi-level pluralism has much greater explanatory power, this idea of consilience from E.O. Wilson. And I guess the kind of things that would be helpful to get feedback on are whether there are implications for testing out this theory in terms of a mathematical formalization, in terms of thinking about dysfunction. And also, I work a lot in evolutionary psychiatry and psychology. I'm trying to work out if this field and these fields can be bridged with information-theoretic approaches, the free energy principle, active inference, and so on. So this is, of course, Tim Bergen's famous 4 questions, where there are questions about proximate causation. You know, what is the structure of a trait? How does it develop over the course of one's life? But of course, it compels us to ask questions about ultimate causation. You know, what is the adaptive significance of this mechanism's existence? Why does it exist at all? What is its evolutionary history? So I'm going to start the mutual space framework by talking a little bit about things I'm sure everyone in this group is much more familiar with than myself. But, you know, when we're asking ourselves what the fundamental principles are that govern life, mind, and culture, science has the materialist conception of the world, which presupposes a single explanatory framework that unites different levels of organization within this pyramid, from physics and chemistry to biology, psychology, and sociology. So very, very broad question to start with. Well, what is life? Energy and information, I'm going to be arguing, are foundational quantities of the universe. Obviously the first law of thermodynamics talks about how energy is conserved, and it underpins all biological processes as the fuel required for maintaining homeostasis. The second law, of course, talks about how entropy or disorder tends to increase. What's interesting is that life seems to solve the problem of entropy. Living systems seem to resist entropy by creating local order. They actively maintain their structure by extracting energy from the environment and converting it into work. And this energy input sustains an organized, low entropy, high information state, which is far from equilibrium. Also, recent papers in the last few decades have demonstrated that information is best thought of as physically instantiated. And actually, this entire process of maintaining this non-equilibrium steady state requires some sort of informational boundary. This enables systems to be nested one within the other, with each level bounded. So, the Markov blanket is a formalism that describes the informational boundary separating an internal system from its external environment, because it applies at multiple scales. A cell membrane, or a brain region with functional boundaries, or organisms interacting with other organisms. The Markov blanket is crucial because they allow systems to model the environment whilst preserving their internal structure. And I guess from a Bayesian point of view, this can be considered self-evidencing, where the Markov blanket enables that internal system to make inferences about the external world. I'm not going to dwell on this, but here are just some properties of living systems that we've touched upon. Obviously, they require a boundary to maintain homeostasis and maintain non-equilibrium steady state. They're thermodynamically open in that they exchange both energy and matter with the external world. They're hierarchically nested and modular. And of course, they're subject to a phylogenetic history and a history of selection dynamics. They're self-organising, this term from complex systems, whereby order arises spontaneously from within. And I'll be touching more about self-organisation in a bit. They're engaged in a form of inference about hidden causes in the external world. And then we can think of living systems as, especially the more complex ones, as multi-scale architectures that engage in uncertainty minimization. And this allows them to maintain their self-organizing critical points that balance flexibility with stability. And of course, an older term or series of concepts is emergent properties. This idea that at higher levels of organization, novel properties emerge, and these confer greater complexity. So I want to focus in this talk on this idea of structured information. So the first thing to say is that one reading of what I've been saying is that energy and information are obviously intimately linked in living systems. Maintaining order far from equilibrium requires a continuous supply of free energy, and this free energy is used to sustain informational gradients across a Markov blanket. The gradient being the differences in structured information inside versus outside a system. So without energy input, these gradients collapse, leading to disorder and functional breakdown. So these diagrams, obviously the green leaves are living, energy is going into the system to sustain a low entropy, high information state. The dead leaves have no energy input, no boundary, and lose their information as they eventually dissipate and equilibrate with the external environment. So living systems must be able to store structured information that is relevant to phylogenetic contingencies, and they need to do this in order to reduce uncertainty about the future and act more effectively. So we could think about this structured information as priors. We could think about it as representations or generative models or some sort of capture of historical contingencies. I'm going to be referring to this as a narrative. And I'll be elaborating on this concept and talking about how it's biologically instantiated in a moment. The second key component to the mutual space framework is the idea of contingency. So I'll be heavily reliant on the idea of narrative and contingency through this talk, but I want to start with a philosophical distinction that I'm sure we're all aware of. between the idea of necessity, whereby simple, closed, deterministic systems governed by natural laws can be straightforwardly modeled, planetary motion or simple physical or chemical processes, contrasted to the idea of contingency, whereby biological systems heavily dependent on complex, probabilistic, phylogenetic trajectories that have a big component of chance involved and don't follow simple laws of necessity. Indeed, the idea that the phylogenetic development of life, especially at the level of organisms and species, is highly structured by unpredictable contingencies was the great insight of evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. Mayr tells us that there is nothing inevitable or necessary about the development of any one species, but rather it is governed by geographical, historical, social, and other contingencies. So Mayr is a really critical thinker. He moves us away from essentialism and teleology and towards an understanding that systems do not have an inherent nature, but rather are constantly changing, mutable, and varying, with the pattern of their structural functional organization highly dictated over phylogenetic timescales by factors external to them. This is crucial, and this represents a really important idea to keep in mind. It follows logically, in my opinion, that if the idea of contingency exists, it also implies that an evolving informational storage structure, for example, DNA, must persist over time. And I'll be calling this structure a narrative structure. Okay. So far, I've suggested that life requires information storage architectures to resist entropy and navigate uncertainty. We've also spoken about a crucial distinction between living systems and physical systems. Living systems maintain an informational store of historical contingencies as narrative, which is biologically embodied and enables these self-organizing systems to respond to novel contingencies. So this brings me on to what I'm calling the narrative contingency conjecture, which is a meta-theoretical organizing framework for biological systems. I'm going to expand on it later on in the talk, but I wanted to highlight it as the core underlying ontological commitment I'm making ahead of further moves. The central claim is that the NCC helps bridge self-organizing systems with external contingencies across levels of spatial organization and across different timescales. So again, these ideas of narrative as structured information and contingency, which is information from the external state that drives adaptation and that is captured in narrative structures. I probably don't have time to talk about it, but the NCC does reframe evolution in information-theoretic terms, in the sense that, we can view natural selection as this informational, active, iterative, dialectic, generative process whereby contingencies shape narrative structures in populations, and this in turn codes for novel behaviors and adaptive behaviors in individuals. Okay, so to just wrap up this section, I'll hope to argue that all self-organizing biological systems minimize uncertainty by maintaining information gradients across Markov blankets, using energy expenditure as the mechanism for resisting entropy, and that at all scales, biological systems must balance two forces, narrative and contingency. And the interaction of these forces occurs in what I call the mutual space. This sets us up really for the next question, which is what precisely is this informational architecture that encodes narrative at different scales? And in order to answer this, we'll need to define two key concepts, narrative structures and mutual space. So self-organization and selection require a storage medium for adaptive inference, and narrative structures serve this role across scales. So here we've just got a simple system in the diagram. It could be a cell, it could be a brain network. It has an internal state, it has an informational boundary and an external state. And inside this internal state is the narrative structure that resists external contingencies over phylogenetic or ontogenetic timescales. The narrative structure is essential for the self-organization of the system because it determines how the system develops in order to maintain a balance between flexibility and stability, and is acted upon by external selection processes. So this is what a narrative structure is. a self-organizing informational architecture that encodes the history of interactions with contingency to maintain functional order over time. It's a representational storage architecture of information. And it coordinates this process of self-organization within a boundary, generating an internal model of external states. It's subject to selection pressures, which means it has a phylogenetic history. It operates across multiple levels because the informational boundaries themselves bound higher level structures. But why have I called it narrative? I can talk about this a bit more, but it's because of how these structures are maintaining temporal continuity and non-equilibrium steady state, and how they act as this reservoir or imprint of compressed information that is useful to maintain far from equilibrium state. Okay, so that's the first pivot of the mutual space framework. Now we come on to the mutual space. The mutual space is the space within which narrative structures interact. Narrative structures don't exist in isolation. They interact beyond their informational boundary. And when they do so, they form a mutual space, a shared informational domain whereby local dynamics originating from individual narrative structures interact with global dynamics that emerge from the compressed, high information, low entropy state of the mutual space itself. So the mutual space allows for what I'm calling for the emergence of new adaptive properties. It's a functional scaffold for global uncertainty minimization. It can be considered a free energy landscape. But the crucial thing here is that the mutual space itself might be bounded by an informational boundary like a Markov blanket. And that means that it might become a narrative structure at a higher level of organization. So this diagram captures how a mutual space, so we have a mutual space here on the left that comprises all of these narrative structures. The narrative structures here are interacting within this mutual space, but with a new boundary, there is a new mutual space where that becomes the new narrative structure that interacts with other narrative structures at that level. And so what I'm saying here is that mutual spaces show self-similarity across layers in how they compress information to minimize entropy. So I guess a similar parallel to this might be the idea of holarchy, but it's not quite the same, and I can talk about that later. So mutual spaces become new narrative structures at a higher level of organization. But what's key here is that a narrative structure only has a snapshot of the mutual space. It hasn't got access to the full mutual space. It can only access the mutual space insofar as it interacts with other narrative structures that in some way model the mutual space. We could think about individual organisms interacting with other people as narrative structures engaged in an externalized mutual space. But what I want to focus on in this talk, before then talking about dysfunction, is the neural mutual space. The neural mutual space is where consciousness itself emerges according to this framework as an adaptive scaffold for inference. So we're now going to explore the composition and function of the neural mutual space. Okay, so to ground this discussion, I'm using a tripartite model of the mind which distinguishes between three levels of ontology in the mind: the neurobiological or implementational, which is the most reductive level. It refers to the physical instantiation of the mind in neural circuits and biochemistry. It's the substrate upon which everything else operates. The intermediate level is the functional or computational level, which is the site of kind of unconscious processing algorithms. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, there's the intentional level, which is the site of subjective, conscious, moment-by-moment experience of the world. It's the least reductive and is studied historically by philosophy or phenomenology. And what I'm seeking to do in my talk is focus on bridging the intentional and functional levels. That's what I'll be seeking to do with the mutual space framework, with little reference to their immediate implementational structures in the brain. And I got this model from paper from a couple of years ago, Pietraszewski et al. 2024 in my references. From what I understand, it's a standard framework in cognitive science. But I will be, unfortunately, coining some terms just to clarify what it is that I'm saying. So we've spoken about the implementational level. I'm not going to focus on it too much, but the functional level I'm calling it the base functional scaffold. Using words like scaffold, which are clearly architectural metaphors, allows me to stack on top concepts that makes it easier to understand and unpack what's going on. So the BFS, the base functional scaffold, is the functional level, and it's the set of all evolved functional systems. These evolved functional systems are akin to modules or neurocognitive modules. They're functionally segregated phylogenetically evolved informational units that are engaging in internal processing and external interactions in the mutual space. And the intentional level I'm calling the intentional level scaffold. So the intentional level scaffold is the neural mutual space where these evolved functional systems, which I'm calling narrative structures, reside. So the intentional level scaffold is this dynamic shared space. It's where the evolved functional systems interact, and it's what gives rise to emergent properties like consciousness. So I appreciate there's a lot of new terms, but really what we want to ask ourselves is, in order to bridge the intentional and functional level, we need to ask ourselves, how does the base functional scaffold and the intentional level scaffold differ? And this is what I'll be seeking to answer in the next slide. Okay, so just a summary of the terms. The base functional scaffold is the set of all narrative structures within the neural mutual space, evolved functional systems or modules or whatever you want to call them. I don't like the term modules. It tells us, the BFS tells us what there is, but not how they interact. Okay. Evolved functional systems are these modular narrative structures with distinct but overlapping phylogenies. They encode structured information about historical contingencies. So there are many different terms for them, but I'm just keeping it quite simple to distinguish from the literature. And then we have the intentional level scaffold itself, the neural mutual space, a higher order interaction space where these evolved functional systems function in unison. It's also worth saying, because the intentional level scaffold is equivalent to the dynamic neural mutual space, it becomes, at a higher level of organization, its own narrative structure that is modeling the external environment. And that is what I'm claiming is the generative model of conscious experience, the kind of Umwelt. So this diagram is just kind of showing how these computational units of the base functional scaffold interact, these evolved functional systems. So here we have a bunch of evolved functional systems. It doesn't really matter what they are for now, but inputs enter the brain constantly through sensory information, exteroception, interoception, proprioception, so on. A model of perception is created, which feeds into outputs and is tethered to action. And then this process is recursive. So each evolved functional system is a narrative structure with its embedded historical priors, and the BFS is just the sum of all of these. But the ILS is the mutual space in which they're interacting. It is the site of conscious experience in that sense. Okay, so just to summarize what I've been saying, each evolved functional system is a narrative structure. These narrative structures are self-organizing informational units that encode solutions to past contingencies. Over evolutionary time, organisms have accumulated a hierarchy of these evolved functional systems, allowing for increasingly complex cognition and behavioral flexibility. So at the lower end, and these EFSs exist on a gradient, of course. At the lower end, we have domain-specific, hardwired systems that are phylogenetically older, very highly conserved, and very difficult to disrupt. They might be involved in, say, governing sensory perception or reflexes or attention or perception. Whereas at the higher end, we have more integrative, domain general systems. These are involved in executive functioning or metacognition or I don't know, attachment or social bonding, whatever it is. These systems are more flexible, but they're also more fragile, being more recently evolved, and they're more susceptible to disruption by social and environmental factors. And this is going to be critical for us understanding mental function and dysfunction. The claim will be that psychiatric disorders often involve selective vulnerabilities in higher order evolved functional systems, and this leads to mutual space fragmentation. And that is what I'll be underlining as a key component of psychiatric dysfunction. Okay, so I've explained the composition of the base functional scaffold and the evolved functional systems within it. We can now move on to look at the neural mutual space in a bit more detail. So at the functional level, the neural mutual space, given that it is beyond the individual boundaries of the evolved functional systems, is this informational exchange domain where global activity is coordinated and emergent properties arise. It acts as an optimization platform for minimizing global free energy. But at the intentional level, with this informational boundary around all of these narrative structures, we can think of the ILS as a narrative structure of consciousness. So here we've moved up a level of organization, and here's what happens in the ILS are intentional level phenomena. So here's what we experience phenomenologically, things like thoughts and emotions and memories, or even mood phenomena, which are acting over a longer temporal horizon. These all emerge from how the evolved functional systems interact within the neural mutual space. Okay, so the intentional level scaffold isn't simply the sum of the EFSs, it's a higher order emergent structure. And crucially, the integrity of the neural mutual space is required for cognitive coherence. So I define this term narrative coherence, which is a metric that measures how stable the mutual space is, how well aligned, how stable inference is, how efficiently information flows. This is what narrative coherence is capturing. Of course, if the mutual space becomes misaligned or fragmented, functional integration breaks down. This leads to disruptions in cognition and perception. And that's demonstrated by if you had a localized insult, like a stroke or something, you could wipe out specific aspects of the neural mutual space, and that would have its own unique phenomenology. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the phenomenology of mutual space, but it's also worth touching, I guess, on the phylogeny of narrative structures. So obviously, over evolutionary time, life has developed increasingly sophisticated architectures for storing and processing information. This is in order to resist entropy and maintain structure. Important transitions are from the first primitive chemical systems that were autocatalytic and storing energy gradients. And then, of course, we have genetic information storage, bringing with it cellular homeostasis. But most importantly is 600 million years or so ago, where we have the development of nervous systems, these really sophisticated structures that enable a more dynamic, real-time predictive processing and substantial increases in information capabilities. And then, of course, if we fast forward to 100,000 years ago in the Homo sapiens lineage alone, we have the development of a symbolic and cultural systems that are externalized information architectures and enable non-linear and accelerationist phylogenetic dynamics. So we can then look at the neural mutual space phylogeny. We could look at it at the level of when individual evolved functional systems came onto the scene. And the reason I can make such kind of inference is because it follows logically that you can't have affect and the experience of affect without, say, having perceptual inference first, right? So there is a trajectory to how evolved functional systems are added on in a modular sense. The most recent evolved functional system that's been speculated in the literature is what's called the systemizing mechanism by Simon Baron-Cohen. This is basically a novel theory of how humans uniquely generate novel kind of cognitive meta-representational structures through generative invention about 100,000 years ago. The main thing to take away from this really is that Earlier organisms obviously had simpler domain-specific evolved functional systems, but as the contingencies grew more complex over phylogenetic time, novel cognitive architectures were stacked on top of one another. Perceptual, then affective, then higher order cognitive layers one over the other, adding novel narrative structures and changing the dynamics of the neural mutual space and the nature of consciousness. Okay, so a couple of slides briefly bringing this to a close and talking a bit about the implications for psychiatry. I'm conceiving of psychiatric dysfunction as essentially being a dysfunction of the neural mutual space. So what I've put here is just a broad function dysfunction axis. On the left, we have normal functioning, and on the right, we move through mild, moderate, and severe dysfunction as an organism, a person accrues increasing functional impairment, with catatonia at the severe end of the spectrum, resulting in psychomotor changes, autonomic nervous system changes, and there is a fatal variant of catatonia called malignant catatonia. But in any case, what we can see is that in normal functioning, and we're thinking about this quite broadly, there are context-appropriate behaviors. This is to say that there is efficient mutual space dynamics characterized by a strong balance between stability and flexibility. So there is high narrative coherence. And I suggest on narrative coherence that we might want to think about it a bit as the inverse of free energy. So as free energy goes up, narrative coherence goes down, and vice versa. So in normal functioning, high narrative coherence, individuals here can adjust their priors and their narrative structures and maintain stable inference. They're effectively minimizing free energy. But as we move towards dysfunction from left to right, we pass through stages of increasing neural mutual space fragmentation. So we start with cognitive rigidity, where priors become overly ossified, they reduce the system's capacity for adaptive inference. We might think of this as, say, things like OCD or problems with basic thinking, delusional processes. But further along, mutual space fragmentation increases, and we see impairments in higher order evolved functional systems that then cascades down to lower order phylogenetically ancient evolved functional systems. When the mutual space starts to fragment, we start to see precision weighting and belief updating becoming inefficient, and this leads to a poor fit between the internal models and external contingencies, meaning that an organism's ability to weather surprising events is reduced. And then, of course, at the extreme end, we see mutual space collapse. We see mutual space collapse. So mutual space collapse occurs because there is total breakdown in adaptive inference. The system can no longer self-correct. It leads to severe context inappropriate behaviors. An example of this is catatonia. The system here reverts to a low energy, primitive attractor state, but narrative coherence has been lost. And so this person isn't able to tether or anchor their behaviors appropriately to the context. So a key insight of this model is that narrative coherence is a central organizing principle of mutual space. And when it's high, free energy is minimized efficiently. But as fragmentation sets in, priors become maladaptive, and this disrupts predictive stability, resulting in compensatory mechanisms as the system struggles to restore coherence. Ultimately, what I'm trying to suggest is that psychiatric dysfunction isn't random. It follows a principled trajectory of increasing misalignment between the generative model or the neural mutual space and external contingencies. Furthermore, active inference itself becomes ineffective as mutual space coherence, narrative coherence degrades. So this unidimensional spectrum suggests we reconceptualize dysfunction as a degree of fit of the organism to the context. And I'm not a specialist in information-theoretic terms, but I wonder if measures like the Kullback-Leibler divergence could help us understand how well the neural mutual space acts as a narrative structure, which is to say how well the functional level maps onto the intentional level. and of course, the key thing to remember about neural mutual space is that it connects the narrative structure components to the external mutual space beyond its own boundary. So it allows for inter-level communication. This principle is crucial when we think about what might cause neural mutual space fragmentation and misalignment. Well, it follows that, damage to the narrative structures themselves, by stroke damage or epilepsy, direct damage to neurons is a lower scale dysfunction. But also mutual space misalignment might be occurring because of upper scale dysfunction, the external environment, social isolation, processes in the social and cultural world that results in a slow progression along a spectrum towards increasing mutual space fragmentation. So there's probably too much to talk about in psychosis. I have a very kind of special affinity for psychosis research. It's obviously a very interesting area, but I want to just talk briefly about catatonia. So catatonia is a complex neuropsychiatric syndrome. It's very heterogeneous. We used to think that it was only secondary to schizophrenic processes, but we now understand that there are numerous routes to developing this final common pathway. So it represents severe dysfunction. And crucially, catatonia can evolve into this functional variant, this fatal variant called malignant catatonia. So this diagram that I drew here on the right isn't based on empirical findings. It's more heuristic. But I'm essentially suggesting that the etiology of catatonia determines the temporality of onset, and this should predict the likelihood of autonomic nervous system involvement. So neuromedical causes of catatonia, like encephalitis or drug-induced, antipsychotics, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, are expected to lead to onset of symptoms quicker and are more likely to progress to autonomic nervous system involvement and fatal variants. Whereas you hardly ever see depressive catatonia, which develops over a much longer period of time, develop into fatal variants. Okay, so the key takeaways from this section is that psychiatric dysfunction might represent a progressive misalignment of neural mutual space. Disorders might differ based on where they fall on the function-dysfunction spectrum. And comorbidity is reframed as a different pattern of mutual space fragmentation, depending on which evolved functional systems are recruited or damaged or impaired. Precision weighting failures, which connect how various evolved functional systems interact with one another, this idea of kind of gain, underlie many disorders. We know that already. But it might be the case that interventions that restore mutual space coherence and inference stability will help us make further breakthroughs. And it might be that this is a central component of, say, a lot of psychotherapies. In fact, narrative exposure therapy, which is one of the best modalities for dealing with the complex phenomenology of PTSD, might well help in increasing narrative coherence in self-concept narrative structures. Okay. So this perspective has major implications. It suggests that interventions could focus on restoring mutual space coherence. This might be through cognitive restructuring, psychotherapies, medications might have this role. This sets us up really for the final section, where I explore the deeper ontological implications of the narrative contingency conjecture I introduced at the start and how it might provide a unifying framework. Okay, so, this is what I'm suggesting is completely speculative. I need to be honest about this, but there might well be a structural equivalence across multiple fields where narrative and contingency are the deeper underlying ontological entities that represent two sides of the same coin. In evolutionary biology, for example, genes are compressed narratives of past contingencies, and they're acted on by processes of selection. Selection being a type of contingency. In complex systems, an evolving dynamical system might maintain a coherent self-organizing structure, but it's got to navigate chaos or stochasticity or phase transitions. So ultimately, there is a potential equivalence here, and what these two sides of the same coin are doing or linked by is free energy minimization. So finally, and I'm sorry to have rushed through this, and I'm happy to clarify a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but what I'm saying here really is that a unified ontology might involve aspects of the mutual space framework and the narrative contingency conjecture. It doesn't claim to be a replacement, but rather it clarifies a common informational structure. So biological systems are narrative encoded, contingency driven, self-organizing systems. Narrative structures are these structures that enable adaptation by maintaining functional stability while interacting with unpredictable environments. It extends active inference by incorporating narrative structures as generative models and clarifying how different levels are linked across mutual space, which is the optimization structure. The evolution of complexity is an iterative process of narrative construction, responding to contingent disruption. At all spatiotemporal scales, narrative is minimizing contingency. Narrative is capturing contingency. There are implications for psychiatry if we think about how mutual space fragmentation might provide a mechanistic grounding for dysfunction. It reinterprets consciousness as narrative coherence in the neural mutual space. And I know that there are actually similarities to Bars's global workspace hypothesis. Scaling relations might be derivable between information storage, narrative, uncertainty, contingency, and free energy minimization. But ultimately, this isn't a mathematical or formal structure. This is just some thoughts that I've been having over the last few months that seem to tie in a lot of different threads. And I'll take this moment to conclude and to thank you for your time and your close consideration of these ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Costa. So if everyone wants to do that, we could unmute ourselves and give Costa a round of applause for his wonderful and ambitious talk. So with the talk being done, now we are going forward to the Q&A session. So if anyone from the audience has any questions, so the first one from Patrice Duquette. Patrice? I think you're still muted, so Patrice, you can go ahead.
Hi. Hi. I'm a psychiatrist in the States. I'm actually right now at a community mental health center, which is like your national health. We take all comers. I'm also observing 3 residents on video as they see patients. So I'm a little distracted because one has a great breakdown in mutual narrative space. Anyway, I wanted to take a minute to say I've been working on these ideas from a different perspective per se. I'm also a psychotherapist. That's what I primarily do. I do individual and group, and we have to talk because I'm at the point where I've written about individual. I've written about different pathologies regarding active inference, interception, all kinds of things. And I'm now writing about group, and you're making sense. So continue doing what you're doing. Take as much as you can here. I think I'm not great with acronyms, so and I'm also was trying to pay attention, but I was really glad that you put in the speaking at the bottom of the page. But your idea of the breakdown of shared mutual space is right, and also thus a narrative that happens in that shared mutual space. The creation of the shared mutual space is essential to treatment. I don't care what treatment. I just had a resident come in and talk about a patient who's psychotic and suicidal, and it was like, you're going to say to him, we have an agreement, right? You will not hurt yourself, and I said, I often say to the patient, I said, I'm old enough, I can say I really want to treat people who stay alive, but also it's very important that you stay alive. So it doesn't matter what level of pathology that you're working at, this mutual space is essential for treatment and also response. And the ideas you had about active inference and those things, they all fit in. Just develop them more. You've got to, I saw Paul Badcock's citation, and I've read his work, and of course he gets it. So I'm really just trying to encourage you and bring in emotion where you can. It's very difficult to bring it in because so many different descriptions, definitions, beliefs about it, but it is ultimately, one of the basic elements that we have to work with in that space and think about it in terms of inference, and, still going in that direction. But so again, as a therapist and individual, I take the patients from individual into group, and I also have two groups. So you had one of your pictures where there were different groups getting together. And I actually then take those two groups into what we call an extended session, where the two groups are together, and they've done this over a couple of years. So they have their group narrative, and then they have the extended group narrative. And it's always interesting because one group thinks it's the better group. And, within the extended session, that often supports them talking more and more effectively than the other group. And as far as efficiency in terms of using the treatment, they do use it better. But the other group learns from that. And that shared space is where they learn it. And can reference like, oh, I saw that person in the other group do this, distinct from their own group. So all your ideas made sense. I just wanted to encourage you. I do have to take care of a couple of crises, but good luck.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. And there are a couple of points there that I thought were quite interesting. So I guess what I'm trying to get at with this mutual space framework is that it's scale invariant. So we could think about these principles at different levels of organization. So we could think about interacting narrative structures in the brain, or we could think about different individuals in group psychodynamic therapy and the unconscious dynamics that those give rise to. So it raises this idea that mutual spaces can be externalized. Mm-hmm. And that's really important because what we're talking about informational boundary isn't a fixed structural entity necessarily. It's probabilistic in origin. So the reason I coined the term mutual space is because it reflects this idea that and you talk about psychotherapy. With your therapist, there is an exchange of mutual information that brings you both to a low entropy, high information state. And that in itself is what does the healing, that dialectic. But mutual space is a concept that allows for multiple interacting structures at the same level and the emergent field that it gives rise to. And I guess field is an important term. Obviously, you might be familiar with Wilfred Bion's work and these ideas of groups that are working and harmonious or basic assumption. And there is this fragmentation of mutual space in that setting. So thank you very much for your feedback. I'm sure there's plenty more that we could say about all of that.
Yeah, what's your email? I'll start there.
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. All right. Again, good luck.
Thank you.
You'll get a lot of information here. Just take a couple of weeks to distill it.
Thank you, Patrice. All right. So next is Jerry Nevins. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. Yeah. Thanks so much. Costa, great talk first, by the way. So I'm coming at this from a couple different angles. My current work is in marketing and communications. So the narrative piece of it is very interesting, but where I started from in life was I thought I was going to be an actor. So it always I love the narrative piece of it from there. And I've been doing some reading on active inference and scripting. And so I was curious if any of that is part of this, because as I was looking at that mutual space and what you're talking about in terms of kind of establishing almost like scripts and roles for where you are in that space, I was just curious Does any of that sort of work from Abelson or other people like Mao who are part of this active inference space? Does that work its way into your approach? Do you see it as just a different type of inference, or not inference, but narrative, or is that something that holds its own space and its own approach for you?
Thank you, Jerry. So obviously I'm coming at it from psychiatry, but the idea of narrative is really interesting. It's clearly foundational at different levels of organization. And in a sense, narrative is the force or the field that enables active inference. So active inference presupposes, in a sense, according to this framework, that there is a narrative structure or a series of hierarchically nested narrative structures. So the reason I chose narrative as a concept is because I was actually coming at this originally from narrative coherence in psychology. This idea that when people are asked to reflect about their own narrative through memory, that seems to correlate to better outcomes, more resilience, and so on. And so the long-standing idea is that narrative is an emergent phenomenon of consciousness. But what I tried to do is invert that and say, no, actually consciousness is presupposed by the existence of narrative structures. And so you're entirely right when you talk about narrative as being typically applied to literature or scripting or film. As far as I'm concerned, it's the same narrative, which is about maintaining continuity, whether it's of the internal evolved system in the brain or the organism itself or the institution or whatever it is. These are all narrative structures in that sense.
Okay, yeah, that totally makes sense, and very interesting work, as Patrice was saying as well. So interested to see where it goes. I think where my head was at, as you were talking about kind of the rigidity that comes in, I think sometimes that comes from seeing yourself in a specific role within the narrative, and it's hard to see yourself as going outside of that role, so you become fixed in that. And I think with what you were showing too, it does again remind me of like a plot. I think the interesting thing for me is that usually we talk about plot in terms of like the way things play out over the course of a story, but in Shakespearean history, it was actually a physical plot where people moved from space to space. So the role and the plot told them where and when to go to interact with each other. So I always find that interesting. But thank you so much, and thank you for the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Next is Ryan O'Leary.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
we can.
All right. First, I want to say that even though I'm here at work in uniform, I'm not representing anyone but myself. This is just my own academic interests. But I'm also a psychiatrist. Right now, I'm in Washington, D.C. And I was when you were talking, you were pointing out that there are many different ways that people have conceptualized kind of what you're talking about. So there's lots of words that are similar to what the ideas that you have. And then you mentioned the word consciousness. I was thinking so it seems like the mutual space is something that's inherently social. So there has to be interactions between things in order to have that mutual space. And then within that mutual space, things emerge that can't emerge within the thing itself. So there's this idea that like language for humans is something that a human didn't make up. It was invented by a society of humans. You have to have social interaction to have language. It cannot exist in a person. So in a way, language itself is a kind of a narrative coherence in a very also explicit way. But would you call that a field? Like in your conception, would language be a field? Because you mentioned that term, like you have this narrative space and then it creates a field.
So yeah, thank you for the question, Ryan. When we're thinking about externalized information architectures, that is to say, not instantiated in biology or in the brain or in cells, we're really thinking about quite amorphous phenomena. So it's very difficult to capture that in word. But to give you an example, with language, which is inherently social, we end up getting oral tradition, which allows us to maintain that externalized information architecture beyond generations. We eventually get the written word a couple thousand years ago, and that allows us again to use language in a written form to maintain and augment that externalized mutual space. The way I think about mutual spaces is twofold. It's an information repository of compressed information that has utility because it tells us something about the past, and it is the medium, the arena for informational exchange. So you could consider language as an emergent phenomena of externalized mutual spaces in that sense, if that makes sense.
Like an instantiation of it.
Yeah, but I would also consider things like, social structures, your local physical social milieu. That's a kind of information space. That's a kind of mutual space. And how you are feeling is determined by the people that you're interacting with and the makeup of that mutual space. So actually, narrative structures, local structures, are highly dependent upon global interaction dynamics that emerge within the mutual space beyond an informational boundary, if that makes sense.
I think so. My next question is probably the hardest one. Before I do something ask you something more practical. You mentioned the word consciousness and how it kind of you think that it basically kind of emerges from this space. This space is a necessary sort of component for that. So does that mean that consciousness can arrive at basically any level of organization as long as it has that space?
Yeah, I mean, so we go into kind of panpsychism here, but I tend to think of consciousness as quite a specific thing that requires neural architectures. So the transition 600 million years ago or beforehand from chemical architectures to highly refined informational architectures that allow for incredible synaptic transmission and communication, that brings with it, according to this framework, novel properties as a result of the narrative structures that are instantiated in the brain. So we wouldn't expect to see consciousness at every level. What we would expect to see at every level where there's a mutual space is novel properties. And that's because of that interaction between local and global dynamics. So we could think about a single cell as having a mutual space. And that allows it to do things that it couldn't do without the informational boundary and other narrative structures that it's communicating with. So, for example, quorum sensing in bacteria. This is a kind of emergent phenomenon. I wouldn't call it consciousness. I would call it an emergent phenomenon, or I would call it compressed information that at a higher level can act as its own narrative structure, which I guess we experience that phenomenologically through memory, in a sense. So I'd have to, the consciousness area is very deep waters, and it required probably a lot more unpacking. But if you remember what I was saying about the functional level and the intentional level, the functional level consists of the sum of all of these evolved functional structures, and it's moving through real time at the speed of 1 second per second. So if there wasn't an emergent intentional level, there would be no way for a narrative continuity that enables the system to through memory or complex planning, I'm talking phenomenologically here, to sequence that continuity over time. It would just be neural structures progressing over time in response to the external world. It's inconceivable that they could do that without the emergent phenomenon of consciousness.
Okay. I'll have to re-listen to that when I go back after this is posted a couple of times. And then finally, there's you talked a little bit about catatonia. I really am interested in catatonia. I've done a lot of reading on it, and especially having to treat patients who are neuroatypical to begin with, and how prone to catatonia they really are. It's often missed because in patients like autism, with autism spectrum disorder, a lot of what they do overlaps with some of the symptoms of catatonia, and you don't know that they're becoming catatonic because they already had those, but they're worsening in some cases. So it's really a question of careful careful historical history taking. But I was wondering if you thought there was a difference in what's happening in the in that narrative space between the hyperkinetic type of agitated versions of catatonia versus the more hypokinetic or withdrawn types of catatonia.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess the first point about autism, remember I posited a spectrum between context-appropriate normal functioning and progressive fragmentation of the mutual space, where you start with cognitive rigidity and then you go to increasing fragmentation as you recruit dysfunction in more evolved functional systems, and then you end up in collapse. But actually, people with autism probably start with a more cognitively rigid mutual space, which predisposes them to psychosis, to other psychiatric phenomena, and to this kind of catatonia overlap syndrome. So that's the first thing I'd say about that. About your point on periodic or alternating catatonia, I would expect that you see excited catatonia in more manic predisposing states, which come on faster and burn out faster, or may develop into a malignant catatonia. Excited catatonia is more likely to, whereas the stuporous, more conventional form is seen in much slower developing forms of catatonia. So that's why I say that the temporality of onset might be a clue as to the etiology.
And that's all I had.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan. I think next is P. Rajiv Pratap.
Hello, sir. I am a student of class 10 in India. I have a few questions about your speech, sir. Sir, you were talking about... Sir, can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you. It's just a bit quiet.
Is it okay now, sir?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay now, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, you were talking about mathematical formulation, generalization of that sample space, the neural space, sir. Sir, how are you planning to achieve that? And what kind of mathematics and what style of mathematics can be used? And you were also saying that it would be a probabilistic result, sir. Sir, what would be the kind of distribution for the probabilistic results, sir?
Yeah. So you're quite right. I haven't offered any mathematics here. I have to be very honest that my background is not mathematical, but I would suspect that we can utilize, if there is a derivation available, the mathematics of the free energy principle. So I suggest, for example, that there might be information-theoretic matrices like the Kullback-Leibler divergence that might measure the distance, the statistical distance between how well a neural mutual space, which is a functional level characterization, equates to a narrative structure of consciousness at a higher level of organization. And that equivalence, of course, corresponds to the context appropriateness of behaviors to the external world. So, you ask about probabilistic distributions, and, if I'm saying that what is going on here is an optimization process, either over ontogenetic timescales through self-organization and a fluid response to changing external world, or phylogenetically, there must be some sort of optimization problem or variational dynamics that can solve for this. Essentially, it's an optimization problem, I imagine.
It appears my Wi-Fi is a bit dull. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep.
Yes, sir. So I myself, I am a physics student. I do research in unification of forces and energy principles, as you said. So, sir, I was thinking maybe if I actually hadn't attended the session fully, sir. I had joined only halfway through. So maybe later, if I can get in touch with you, so maybe we can derive the mathematical formulation that you were trying to achieve, sir.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think something like this is, of course, I've got to be upfront, completely useless without mathematics, because we cannot test, we cannot disprove, we cannot validate something like this. It is just speculation at this stage. So I've got to be very, very clear and upfront about that.
Okay, sir. So I also have another question, sir. So this question might be a bit off topic, or it might be like, okay, not that good of a question, sir. But back when Mr. O'Leary was talking about narrative languages, sir, languages as narrative. Sorry, I forgot the word. So, is it that some people that cannot understand a few things, or that cannot, like, for example, they cannot speak properly, or they may be dyslexic or autistic? Can their brain interpret whatever we speak, whatever we do, what they see in a different way, sir, like as a separate language for that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if I may have misinterpreted the question, but I guess the question I thought was being asked is that, is there differences in how the narrative structure of consciousness varies across different psychopathologies or different people with different brain predispositions? Yes. Is that right?
Yes.
So the crucial thing is, have I got that correct?
Yes, sir, you have got
that. Yes. So the crucial thing is that because our neural mutual space is entrained by idiosyncratic and unique variables for everyone, we would expect a priori a unique phenomenological experience and a unique degree of narrative coherence to the neural mutual space in everyone.
Yes, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
So can I get your email, sir?
Yes. It might be easier if we could circulate it
Yeah.
Because I'm unable to access the chat to put it in.
Yes. We'll certainly circulate. Yes. Thank you, Rajiv. Are there any other questions in the audience? So maybe I can chip in and suggest a very interesting book. It's a textbook actually by Christoph Adami, The Evolution of Biological Information. Has been published last year. And I think you will find a lot of the required concepts and even formal constructs to make more rigorous what you want to build. So yeah, I suggest you read that. And I think it's now Carl's turn to ask questions, propose answers.
Are you sure you don't want to ask a question?
Carl, you know that sometimes I ask too many questions, so this time I will let you do it.
That's very reserved of you.
Yeah, quite atypical, right?
Good. Well, thank you very much. Well, both of you. Yeah, an excellent presentation, very fluent, very clear. You're a very, very good presenter, and also a really nice set of conversations, which happily have been recorded. So that's nice, and will provide a resource for both the sides of the conversation. Just to situate my feedback or summary, what do you hope to do with this framework and these ideas?
So I think I could think about my goals in a hierarchy. My most immediate goal is understanding how frameworks like the free energy principle can be bridged with evolutionary psychiatry as it currently stands, which is a field that derives its intellectual heritage from evolutionary psychology, evolutionary anthropology, and biopsychosocial psychiatry, which doesn't typically have an evolutionary framework. So these ideas are obviously great as we try to come up with theories for different mental disorders that generate novel predictions. But my suspicion is this field will have to be bridged at some point with active inference. And one of the big questions, of course, is modularity, and this idea of, well, how does modularity fit into? Because the evolutionary psychologists love their cognitive modules, these things that evolved in response to recurrent adaptive problems our ancestors would have faced. And so that's why I got thinking about how could we think about the mind as consisting of narrative structures, evolved functional modules, that are their own predictive processing architecture, and that the interaction of these is what gives rise to phenomenal experience, which can obviously go wrong in psychiatric illness. I guess the other thing is there's a concept of evolutionary mismatch. This idea that our minds developed as for hunter-gatherer environments, the mismatch that we currently experience in society with the technologically advanced industrialized societies that render us kind of cut off from other narrative structures, other people, means that we are at higher risk of mutual space fragmentation. So are these kinds of things, so the bigger goal then is there something to this framework that could be used to generate novel predictions, used to inform the explanation of how different psychotherapeutic modalities or treatments actually work? Can we explain comorbidity or variation in individual presentation? These are the kind of thoughts that I'm having.
And in articulating those thoughts, I mean, are you going to, from a personal point of view, develop a career as an academic psychiatrist and a theoretician, lecturing, writing papers, or writing books? How are you actually going to, beyond for your own personal satisfaction of understanding, how are you going to make a difference? What's the vehicle?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar, Prof, but I'm currently on a psychiatry training pathway, and I'm right at the start of that, which means that 100% of my time is committed to clinical training right now, and it will be, I guess, for a number of years. The hope would be that I can try and do some sort of academic work in the future. I've been involved before in papers, as I say, in evolutionary psychiatry. But there are too many contingencies for me to be able to map out exactly where this would take me. In an ideal world, I'd be able to construct a more formal framework and find ways to test it. But right now, as I say, I've been working on this in my free time, and I've synthesized a lot of different areas and thoughts I've been having over many years to construct this framework.
I see, yeah. So an ideal scenario then would be to do a sort of, not an intercalated, but a PhD, or possibly a part-time PhD after you finished your psychiatric training, and then write a thesis. And then if you were affiliated with the philosophy department, the normal route then would not be so much a series of peer-reviewed papers, which would have severe constraints on the word length, but a series of books predicated on the thesis work. That may be part-time if you want to continue your specialist training. Okay. Right. So I'm just thinking about the kind of feedback which would be useful. And now I have in mind that you are now building a CV that may have a number of blogs and co-authorships and possibly provisional white papers in order to secure a PhD studentship. So you can write the thesis as the basis for the book. And I think the sort of help or the feedback that would be most useful comes in two flavors. One speaks to your last response, which is to formalize this narrative account. And by narrative account, I mean literally the narrative account that you put on the table, but also the fact that it is an account that rests upon words. As opposed to an account that you could put into a simulation in a computer and show, oh, this is how it works, and this is a digital twin of somebody with catatonia, and I can now show you the mechanisms that underlie this particular response to the sensed world. And then the other flavor, I think, is joining the dots with related ideas, and I think that was Robert's notion that there may be stuff in terms of out there already in different fields that would speak to your argument. And just to acknowledge, it strikes me that you are already extremely well versed and very scholarly in terms of picking up on all the key themes over the years, and also current thinking, in terms of assimilating and providing a synthesis, a narrative synthesis at this stage, that covers the ground that you want to cover. So what I've done is, as I was listening to you, I've been picking out papers that may be useful either in terms of a worked example showing how one could put this into mathematics and link it formally with the physics of self-organisation or information theory, artificial life, simulations of Evo-Devo, or papers that enable you to reference, please see Soames et al. For a related perspective, but focusing on X or Y or Z. So you don't have to get into, deep into the arguments of these other perspectives, but just acknowledge that they exist and that they are consilient and resonate with the story, the narrative that you're trying to tell. But you talked about so much, I ran out of space at the end. So I will briefly go through, I think, about sort of 12, no, possibly 8 papers that may not be useful. And as always, I should apologize. It's all self-referential because that's the work that I know. That is either me or my friends. But some of them may be useful. Again, I have to acknowledge you've already sort of engaged, I know, with the right people, specifically people like Paul Badcock. So his thinking is very closely aligned with yours. He also has a very sort of narrative commitment to a narrative account without getting distracted by the seductive aspects of mathematics and formal accounts. So I know you've been in correspondence with him, but I'll still put a couple of his papers up there just for the people watching this recording so that they know who we're talking about. But if you can maintain your relationship with Paul, I think that would be, I think there would be a lot of mutual support available there, specifically given your commitment to understanding things in an Evo-Devo, evolutionary psychology, and specifically Tim Bergin's sort of ontology. That's something that he likes very much as well. Right, so where to start? Perhaps start at the end. So let me, let me start at the end. I'm going to now grab the screen, largely because the papers I've selected will jolt my memory as to the point that I thought might be useful for you. So if I can now share my screen. Now, hopefully you can see this, and you may be asking, why on earth have I put this up? So this is the one I wanted to highlight was this inner screen model of consciousness from Chris Fields. This paper is now being rewritten, I think, for the Journal of Consciousness Studies by Chris himself, who will become the first author. But at the moment, this is the only documentary evidence of this synthesis publicly available. The reason I'm putting that up is to answer your question: could one formalize? So this is flavor one. Staying close to the physics and trying to articulate the veracity of the ideas as understood by a physicist or a mathematician in a way that ultimately you could actually use as a basis of numerical studies or indeed analytic studies to substantiate the narrative arguments. And what you were asking was, could one express different levels of belief updating in these belief structures that you talked about, right up to the level of conscious processing, or the kind of inference or belief updating that would be associated with consciousness in terms of KL divergences? And the answer is absolutely yes. And it's relatively simple to do that. So at the end of the day, what we are talking about, whether we're talking about natural selection that's selecting the phenotype with the greatest marginal likelihood of being present in this, or being consistent or adaptively fit to this eco niche, right through to active inference and the evidence that underwrites the self-evidencing, searching for evidence from my generative models. At the end of the day, all of these things can be written as expressed in terms of self-information or free energy or log marginal likelihood or log model evidence. They're all different perspectives on the same mathematical quantity. The key thing from your point of view is that you can unpack that fundamental, it's not really an objective function, but it's something that describes the thing that looks as if it is maintained or optimized. You can think of it as adaptive fitness, or you can think of it as the negative of free energy when thinking about processes that look as though they're optimizing something. What are they actually optimizing? So a bit of noise here. So you can write down this quantity, let's call it free energy, as effectively, or negative free energy, as accuracy minus complexity. And the complexity is the difference between your priors and your posteriors. And crucially, when you have a hierarchical model, then you can linearly separate all the complexity. What you have is basically a mathematical statement of what it appears is being optimized, which is the accuracy, which is just a function of the sensory data or the interface or the inputs to a particular system, and the first level, the very low level, perhaps, you know, with a bit of poetic license, your sort of base level, not below the base structure, you know, the actual implementation level. If you allow me, if I just interpret narrative as a generative model, which may or may not be shared, and it may be at a particular scale that's not associated with an individual or a specific cell, but it can still be written down as a graphical model, a generative model. Then we're talking about the level of the level of the model that is closest to the sensorium, or the level below, or the input to that system. So your objective function then is the accuracy, which is just a function of the representations of the states of the Bayesian beliefs encoded by the state of the system at this lower level and the sensory input. Everything else with each subsequent level now is just a KL divergence. So if it is a case that consciousness lives at a right at the top or right in the center, or in some way that it is unique and irreducible, then it could certainly be described as a KL divergence, and it would simply be the KL divergence between the implicit beliefs encoded by the state of this irreducible top part, which would be, I think, your intentional level, and though the objective posterior probability of the states beyond that level, the rest of the brain, for example, or the rest of the generative model, the rest of the community, posterior probability of its states under the model, given all that this irreducible high level I'm trying to remember what you might call it. Sorry, the reason I'm pausing is because Christine will call it the inner screen, but let's call it the inner screen. So this highest level of abstraction, this intentional level.
I'd call it the intentional level scaffold, which intentional level phenomena reside within.
Right, so well, let's just call it the intentional level. So the intentional level, basically, when conceived of as the deepest or the most irreducible center of some generative model, is receiving inputs of some kind, some messages or some evidence of some kind from all the lower levels. and at the same time is acting upon the lower levels in order, technically, in terms of Bayesian mechanics, to provide empirical priors or constraints or inductive biases that coordinate the sense making and the different sort of the less abstract machinations that are going on below, then the chaos divergence would be between what this highest intentional level thinks is going on and the actual probability of what is going on below, given all of its inputs. And that's why I put the inner screen model of consciousness up here, because what that says is consciousness can be possibly uniquely associated with this innermost, highest intentional level that is irreducible in some sense, in the sense that there's no way of carving it up or putting Markov blankets within this. It is what it is, and it can only see itself through its interactions with everything else, all the lower levels. If that's the case, then mathematically you could then certainly say the quality of this processing is measured by chaos divergence, which would be the complexity of this level, which would be a linear component of the overall free energy of the entire system. That's also quite nice from the point of view of Bayesian mechanics and generative modeling in general, because intentions are really prior beliefs. And as soon as you get away from the very first level that has that owns the accuracy, everything else is an empirical prior. So what you are saying is effectively the intentionality, or the space of intentions, is written in the space of prior beliefs that cannot be reduced any further, nor do they have anything on top of them constraining them. So they are technically full priors as opposed to empirical priors, which are the intervening posterior beliefs as you get up to your highest level, which is another reading of the inner aspect of the inner screen hypothesis. I'll just qualify this open brackets, because I don't think you really want to go down this particular route, but you can rewrite the free energy principle not in terms of classical information theory, but in terms of quantum information theory. When you do that, the separation between the different levels, the intentional and the functional, for example, which in the classical context would be statistically a Markov blanket, now becomes something called a holographic screen. And then you can apply things like the holographic principle and the principle of unitarity to the levels, the intentional level and the functional level, that are separated by a holographic screen, to which they both read and write classical information. This is why it's called a screen. And the inner screen basically means that you can't sort of put any further screens inside the bulk of the intentional level, or the intentional space, close brackets. So that's why that paper is there. I hope that might be useful. If it is, I repeat, you'll find the writing of Chris Fields particularly useful in this regard. Although this paper itself, which is a survey of different theories of consciousness that all fit into this information-theoretic framework, may itself be useful in terms of the references it has. I mention that because you did say how close some of your narrative was to Barr's global workspace theory. This is taken quite seriously in this paper and discussed in terms of the global neuronal workspace theory of people like Stanislav Dehaene and his colleagues. So you might also want to read this, but I repeat, the primary objective was to put Chris Fields and inner screens on the table as a formal description of your intentional level. So we've done that one, which is good. Let's just go back to the beginning. So for everybody else, this is Paul Badcock's first paper, but it took him 5 years to get somebody to publish it. So it actually came out after a lot of his other papers. But it does, if you like, set the scene for this extended account that joyfully accommodates both the phenotypic timescales of inference and learning and sense making and social neuroscience, right through to evolutionary psychology and Evo-Devo-like accounts and beyond. And he refers to that as a hierarchically mechanistic mind. Paul himself, I think, is an educational not educational, but certainly is a clinical psychologist dealing with adolescents, and has again sort of a clinical and psychiatric sort of investment in making these ideas work for the greater good, and indeed took those ideas in quite a compelling way to talk about why we are depressed and how important it is to be able to be depressed by leveraging this evolutionary systems perspective on sense making as understood under the free energy principle and decision making under the free energy principle. So I thought this is a very nice little paper. I think, in Trends in Cognitive Science by Badcock et al. So that's Paul's work. What did I want to? Oh, yes. You may also, so this is now flavor type 2. These are sort of bodies of work that you would appeal to in order to get some moral support or shaking hands with other theoreticians who come from different fields. So this is work overseen by people like Maxwell Ramsted and Axel Constant, who have both done a lot of work, both in the free energy principle, but also in terms of variational niche construction or formal accounts of niche construction, taking it right the way through to cultural niche construction, which just is, if you like, the genesis of your shared narratives that live in this space, which is beyond the individual, beyond the phenotypic level, and he writes both of them write very nicely, but Axel also writes very nicely about how important it is to take this niche construction perspective, and in particular right the way through to cultural niche construction and relating it to fields of attention and deontic cues that we provide ourselves and build ourselves, such as language, for example, simply because from the point of view of the physics, the exchange across this holographic screen, or the interface, say, for example, between the intentional and the functional, or between the phenotype and the environment, the maths in the action perception loop, or that bidirectional exchange that defines this system as being open, because this system is now open to another system, whether you call it the sort of the individual or the thing or the particle, and its heat bath, its environment, or its external milieu is irrelevant. There's two systems and they're in bidirectional exchange, therefore they are open to each other, and in being open to each other, then there is a mathematical symmetry. So as much as you are trying to make sense of your world, the world is trying to make sense of you in some way. Obviously, there are asymmetries in the way that works, but still the same principles apply. And of course, from that perspective, one can regard deontic cues, or indeed books, as artifacts that are subject to natural selection, and one could argue do a better job than us in terms of living for much longer, are there because they have learned about the things that write them or print them or produce them. So there's this very nice sort of inversion in terms of the normal way that we think about adaptive fitness of the individual in an ensemble or in a niche. The niche itself also has an adaptive fitness in relation to its occupants and the things are constructed. So these ideas have been taken forward in the context of ethology by authors, again, with a very particular interest in sort of psychiatry and social psychiatry in Montreal in Canada. And this one specifically focuses on narrative as active inference, which I'm guessing is not so far away from the notion, the way that you're using the word narrative. So this, I thought, would be a useful set of authors to just to drill down on if you haven't done already, and I suspect you probably have. Another person I think that I'm surprised Robert didn't mention is Mike Levin. Have you come across Mike Levin's work?
I've not. No, is he more into computer science
No,
and
he's a
machine
biologist.
learning? Oh no, all right.
No. He's quite a famous theoretical biologist, and he's actually a friend of Chris Fields, who was the author of the inner screen hypothesis of consciousness. But Mike is not a mathematician. He's a great theoretician, but enjoys more narrative accounts from the point of view of cell biology and molecular biology. Excuse me. But he has written about sort of things like basal cognition and the cognitive capacities of very simple systems, and also has thought deeply about scale-free accounts of information and memory, and showing that single cells and cultures of cells can learn and have memory of a collective sort in very much the same spirit that you were suggesting. There's lots of his writings that I think resonate with your sort of broad perspective, inclusive perspective, that emphasizes this scale-free aspect, that you're applying the same notions throughout. I've just put rather randomly just chosen this thing from Sean Carroll introducing Mike, but if you go to his website, oh, there it is. Oh, perhaps not quite the one that I wanted, right? It's not Mike's website. Okay. Anyway, if you go to his website, I'm sure you'll find, just looking at the titles of some of his papers, something that'll grab your attention. And I think you'll find his writings very sympathetic to your notions, but they're not at the level of psychiatry or social neuroscience or ethology or evolution at that level. They're at the level of molecules and cells. So, for example, Mike invented or created something called the Xenobot, which is one of the first sort of true artificial life. They're little, if I remember correctly, they're sort of derived from little frog cells, but they move around and sort of do quite remarkable things. Look as though they're quite intelligent. And he made these little things and grows them and cares for them in his laboratory. So he's somebody I think that you would, again, very usefully refer to as an endorsement from another field, which is now not ethology and philosophy, which would be more the sort of Maxwell Ramstead module crowd, but much more the principles of self-organisation, biotic self-organisation at a much more basal or elemental level, but emphasising the same scale-free themes. This is, I put this up because I thought you might be interested in this in terms of what is the empirical evidence for this kind of cultural information that is, and what are the mechanisms that enable the transgenerational passage of information and objects that live only in this sort of cultural space. And I'm thinking here of people, the work of people like Cecilia Hayes, and in her book Cognitive Gadgets. I mean, what is a canoe, and how come canoes last longer than I do? But the evidence for it is sparse from an evolutionary point of view. But there is some work trying to look at archaeological evidence for the nature of this cultural and informational transmission from generation to generation. And this is a very scholarly work written by the senior author and Hector Manrique in Spain, looking specifically at the evolution of the hand axe and looking for the evidence that the hand axe is an artifact that has emerged, and how does it emerge, and actually appealing to the free energy principle to suggest how it might have emerged, but crucially also from the perspective of sort of not cultural niche construction, but certainly the ability to imitate and to have the right sort of phenotypic configurations that are themselves subject to selective pressure in order to imitate and to recognize almost paradoxically very novel behaviors. And I say paradoxically because the whole point of survival is to maintain yourself in particular characteristic states. So you want to try and resist new things that will take you out of those characteristic states. So this is a thoughtful treatment, and it's the only one I know of because I was directly involved. But it did seem to be pertinent to some of your arguments. This work here is halfway between flavor one, mathematical examples, worked examples in the literature using maths and numerical studies, and bodies of conceptual work, more narrative accounts that speak to this your thesis. And I put it up because it's interesting from 2 points of view. First of all, it was a paper that was written and inspired by Mike Levin, who is this person at Tufts that I mentioned. You really want to go and surf his website, and also a close colleague, Giovanni Pizzullo. And the challenge here was to do exactly what you were talking about, which is understand the mechanics of self-organization that is federated and global, that supervenes on the individual phenotype. And it is an interesting and beautiful and quite tricky thing to actually write down the maths of this and to simulate it. But we were able to simulate it by assuming that each, in this instance, cell or agent in an ensemble had a shared generative model, a shared narrative. So evolution had endowed every member of this ensemble, every little phenotype, with the same generative model or narrative. But crucially, this narrative included included the contextual aspects that allowed each of these cells to behave in a particular way if they knew their place in a grander ensemble. So they all start off the same, pluripotential, but they're all equipped with a certain context sensitivity in their generative models, in their narratives, that allow them to self-organize in a way that they all find their own place in an ensemble. And only when they've found their place and inferred where they are, do they interpret where they are on the basis of what they receive, but also broadcast where they are, enabling other members of the ensemble to infer where they are relative to where you are. And so the joint free energy, or the joint the joint free energy is minimized, or the joint adaptive fitness is maximized, so that there is specialization and individuation that emerges and depends upon the collective. It is, it literally supervenes on the fact you've got multiple phenotypes that all have exactly the same shared underlying generative model that has this, I repeat, context sensitivity. And interestingly, we were able to then do a bit of create sort of psychopathology of this pattern formation or morphogenesis or self-organization, and create sort of little weird patterns just by breaking the communication between the cells in a way not dissimilar to what you're describing in terms of coupling or communication between the different levels in psychopathology. So that might be, if you like, I repeat, an example of it's a very concrete example. You're going to have to sort of dress it up, but at least it's an example that has some of the essential features of what you called emergence, and I think philosophers could also say the way that certain scales of self-organization supervene on lower levels in a lawful way. And this might be an interesting example of that. So the reason I put this up here is again flavor one. It's a mathematical or information theoretic justification for you to use the word information in a narrative sense. So normally if you were speaking to me or Chris Field, when you say information, I immediately assume you're talking about the negative log probability of an event, and you're not. You're talking about information about something, information that can be accumulated, inherited, and communicated. And of course, this is information about something. And that puts, I think, if you want to formalize that distinction, you now again have to come back to this fundamental separation between the system in question and the non-system. Because if the system in question has beliefs, it must have beliefs about something. So its probabilistic state must pertain to something else. So there has to be a distinction between the something and the something else. And that's, of course, in the free energy principle, the classical free energy principle, that's a Markov blanket. In the quantum formulations or quantum information theoretic formulations, that's a holographic screen. But as soon as you have this separation between something and something else, the whole point of the free energy principle is that you can interpret the information theoretic treatment of the thermodynamics, if you like, of the something as holding beliefs or information about something else. And that formally transpires to be related to something called information geometry, and crucially, the very fact that you've got this separation under the free energy principle allows you to make a distinction between an intrinsic information geometry, which is basically the Shannon-esque information theoretic description of the thing, and an extrinsic information geometry, which is the information geometry about something else. And I think it's that for you. Obviously, it's something else is everything else that I have to talk to or speak to or live with or negotiate. Interestingly, and that's not why I put it up, but one can take that dual aspect information geometry and actually propose that as a form of dual aspect monism in theory of philosophy of mind situations. So this particular paper was actually philosophy of mind as written by a physicist, or certainly somebody trying to articulate things in information geometry, using this dual aspect information geometry that supervenes on exactly the same thing. The thing being the thing, its Markov blanket, and the environment in which the thing is embedded and separated from by the Markov blanket. Using the maths to say, well, is this not a good model for consciousness, or the dual aspects of consciousness in terms of mens rea and well, the mental stuff and the physical stuff. I don't think, from your point of view, the consciousness argument is so important here, but I do think it's important that there exists a dual notion of information that can be the information about the thing in question, or it can be an extrinsic information geometry, which means that, I repeat, the thing in question has information about something else, basically not the thing in question, which is, I think, quite a fundamental distinction in many instances. This is flavor 2. Well, how can I motivate? I just wanted to I better motivate that. I saw this going. Well, perhaps we just do flavor 1 again and finish with the flavor 1 things. When you talk about scale free and the recapitulation of the same basic principles of self-organization at the different scales, one beautiful example of that being, say, evolutionary theory or theoretical biology, then mathematically, one way of articulating that and formalizing that and putting it into a computer would be to use something called the renormalization group. So this paper is a very dense paper written with Axel Constant and other colleagues, including Chris Field, who we've spoken about. He's the inner screen guy. This gentleman here is the Axel Constant that was on the narratives of active inference paper I mentioned previously in Montreal. And what this does is it applies the renormalization group to free energy minimizing processes at separate scales, basically phylogenetic and ontogenetic, and then asks the deep question, how are the different scales coupled? And what would that look like in terms of neurodevelopment as a phenotype versus evolutionary trajectories at a phylogenetic scale, and how one can understand these two scales of maximizing adaptive fitness in terms of how one informs or contextualizes the other, and how the slower scale, the phylogenetic scale, supervenes on the phenotypic scale. And there's a worked example at the end at the level of cell biology in terms of neuronal sort of natural selection written as Bayesian model selection at the level of selecting the right synapses on a dendrite, as a very sort of microscopic example, but in principle the same principles apply at any scale. So that might be an interesting, a useful point of reference if you wanted to point to the formal literature. There are other references in this space, but I like this one, not least because I wrote it, so I know what it says, but specifically because it leverages the renormalization group and thereby makes the scale invariance very, very upfront and very, very explicit. So, and in fact, that scale invariance is a common theme in much of Chris Field's work as well. So the last couple, basically, when you were talking about the sort of the psychopathology, the disconnect, as you probably know better than most people in watching this recording, in our work, this is all reduced to a failure of message passing due to, in a predictive coding formalism, a failure to assign the right precision to the sending messages from one level to the next level, and thereby getting this kind of disintegration that you were talking about that leads to a loss of coherence. And I was also struck that seems very consistent with people would say people like Uta Frith and Francesca Happe's notion of central coherence in autism, that this is exactly what is missing when the intentional levels, the very high, deep, irreducible levels, are not properly integrated with everything else and start to disintegrate, and losing central coherence in exactly, I think, the way that you meant, and that this can be very simply explained by a failure of mutual message passing between the different levels that has some relatively simple neurophysiological and neuropharmacological correlates. The reason I put this up is twofold. One, because it's a nice review, which means that you can harvest all the references in this, which I think there are over 100, but no, over 200 references speaking to this argument. But also, because it highlights precision, and from the point of view of sort of biological psychiatry, neuromodulation, and psychomimetics, psychedelics, and psychoactive drugs more generally, and therapeutic drugs, you're now in the space that somebody like Mark Soames. Have you come across Mark Soames's work?
I've read that book.
You've read that book? Oh, well, there you go.
In fact, there's a great diagram of what happens when you damage selectively aspects of the Markov blanket in the self-organizing system. And when I was looking at the diagram, it looked like catatonia. This is where I got a lot of those ideas from. A similar thing must be going here in discoordinated, context-inappropriate behavior.
Absolutely, and yeah. So it's great you're aware of Marxism. Just for your interest, so Marxism would be sort of in psychology, doing the equivalent to what you want to do, and doing it exceedingly well. But he has also recently started a little startup in South Africa, building conscious machines, artifacts. So he's had to commit to the formal accounts and move beyond the narrative, neuropsychological and psychoanalytic accounts, to employ software engineers and people to build little artifacts, which I presume he'll then use as digital twins of various disorders of consciousness. Good. Okay, so you already know about that. And I repeat, the reason I put this up is that he really does drill down exactly on this, the importance of precision enabling, selecting the right messages and the right links between the different levels in sense making, and the role of the subcortical systems in so doing. So we've done that. That's very good. And that just leaves this one. Why is this there? Yes, this is actually flavor one. It's a numerical study based upon mathematics that shows something which you mentioned explicitly, which is that these kinds of shared narratives are an emergent property of each individual trying to make sense of her world. So you can either read this or not, and just refer to say that there are numerical studies out there that, under this generic notion that everything is trying to gather evidence for itself, or act in a way to maximize the marginal likelihood of it existing in some way, then the emergence of language and a shared frame of reference and a common ground and a shared narrative is an emergent property under certain conditions. And then you can also read about what those conditions are. Good. So that's all I have to share. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Carl, for correcting my omission of Michael Levin.
I gave you a chance, but you were humble.
You gave me a chance. I know. It's all on me. It's all on me. But I'm surprised you didn't mention other theories of consciousness, because consciousness was such a pervasive notion in Costa's talk.
Yes. That's not my fault. That you can blame him for
that. Yes. Well, thank you, Costa. I think there is a hand from Rajiv Pratap. Rajiv, is that hand left from when you ask your question, or is that a new hand? And is that your hand?
It is a new hand. It's a new hand, sir.
Okay. If you want, we can accommodate another question. So you can go ahead if you want.
Yes, sir. My friend Sakit Ram Sudarshan is also in this meeting. He's my classmate, but he cannot speak as his microphone is broken. So I will be asking questions in his stead.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So the first question is, how is mutual space different from autopoiesis, that is self-creation in life, predictive coding of mind, or meme theory in culture?
So the first question was, how is mutual space different to autopoiesis? Was there a second question?
There is a second question, sir, but he asked it as, how is it different from autopoiesis, predictive coding, or meme theory, sir? Like as the same question, yeah.
Predictive coding, or what was the third one? Sorry.
The meme culture.
Meme culture, memetics. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so autopoiesis is a term that Francisco Varela was a big fan of, and in the ideas of kind of enactivism, there are obviously links to self-organization, but autopoiesis is more the process of self-organization as I read it, whereas mutual structure is a space, an informational space at different scales. How is mutual space related to predictive coding? Well, the narrative structures that comprise a mutual space are engaged in Bayesian inference and predictive coding. And so mutual space consists of numerous entities that are engaged in separate predictive coding, and this gives them a functional specialization. How is mutual space related to the idea of memes and memetics? Well, so memes comes from Richard Dawkins, and it's this idea that ideas are replicators. Because it isn't biologically instantiated, it only really applies at externalized scales. So I would say that the mutual space is a broader ontological claim than memes.
Yes, sir. Sir, I would like to ask a second question, sir.
Please.
Very quickly. Yeah, if possible, Rajiv. Thank you.
Yes, I'll skim through it, sir. Sir, could there be any visible difference between regions of the brain between people in different situations or people with different mental structures, sir?
Yes, absolutely. It's implied by the theory that so at the functional level, humans have the same evolved functional systems, both species typical and species non-typical. But it's the configuration of those systems that determines the dynamics of the mutual space, and that is what is a different phenomenological experience for different people, in essence. So yes, that's implied.
Yes, sir. Sir, thirdly, it's a short one, sir. So you mentioned that mutual space is an ontological construct, sir.
Yes.
Sir, he's asking where the ontological construct resides on, sir.
Where the ontological construct is
residing, sir. He's just
residing. So you could think about it in very abstract functional space, where narrative structures which are physically instantiated give rise to a mutual space, which then becomes a narrative structure. And so the whole point of a mutual space is that it links narrative structures at different levels of organization, but in a functional analog. So you could think of a narrative structure as a functional analog to a generative model. And the mutual space is the external state that influences the parameters of that generative model.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your questions, Rajiv. And once again, let's thank Costa for his wonderful talk. Yes.
Thank you.
All right, so we will make available this on our YouTube channel. And Costa, we will send you the recording once it's uploaded. So Carl, will you be so kind to stop the recording now?